How does a loving father of 4 simply vanish without a trace? On a steamy Texas evening in August of 2013, Brandon Lawson would leave his home just before midnight after an argument with his girlfriend of more than 10 years. He called his father, who lived 3 hours away, and told him he was heading to his house and proceeded to hop into his silver Ford F-150 pickup truck. At 12:30 a.m., Brandon would run out of gas and call his brother for help. At 12:50 a.m., Brandon placed one of his first terrifying calls to 911. Around a half hour later, Brandon's phone was seemingly off, and Brandon has never been seen since. In today's video, we will be diving into the mysterious case of Brandon Lawson, analyzing his 911 calls and simply trying to make some sense out of what happened on that hot, dark night in August of 2013. This is the baffling case of Brandon Lawson. Welcome to The Cellar. Brandon Lawson was born on November 18, 1986, in Fort Worth, Texas. Fort Worth is located around 262 miles north of Houston, Texas, around a 4-hour drive in total. Fort Worth has historically been the center of the Texas Longhorn cattle trade. The city, to this day, still embraces its Western heritage and traditional architecture and design. Fort Worth has a population of around 978,000 residents, making it the 12th largest city in population within the United States. Brandon was born to loving parents Bradley and Kimberly Lawson. He had a large, close-knit family growing up with his brother Kyle, sister Brittany, and half-brother Billy. Throughout Brandon's childhood, he spent a lot of time enjoying the great outdoors. Camping and fishing was a mainstay for the family, and Brandon would one day impart his knowledge and love of the Texas wilderness onto his own children. As Brandon was in the midst of his junior year in high school, he would meet the future mother of his children, LaDessa Lofton. Brandon had been interested in LaDessa and had eventually built up the courage to ask her for her number. From there, the rest is history. The pair were high school sweethearts and were nearly inseparable moving forward. They would go on to have 3 children together over the stretch of their 10-year relationship. After high school, Brandon would eventually secure himself a job as an oil field worker. Oil field workers help extract, store, and process petroleum and natural gas. Prior to his disappearance, Brandon had been working close to 60 hours a week in the oil fields. He and LaDessa had a newborn son, and Brandon was working himself to the bone so he could provide for his family. Now, to give some more context into Brandon's life, Brandon was battling with addiction issues. Brandon had been a user of methamphetamines and had been struggling for years to stay sober. In 2013, it's reported that Brandon had gotten sober and managed to stay that way for around 6 months. But on the night of his disappearance, his brother shared that Brandon had called him to inquire about finding product. He also reported that Brandon had used again, and many believe he was under the influence at the time of his disappearance. We will now dive into the events of August 8, 2013. That evening, Brandon went home to his family. It is reported that he had not come home the night before, and this prompted an argument with his girlfriend LaDessa. She accused Brandon of using again, and the argument got very heated. This eventually boiled over, and Brandon proceeded to call his father in Crowley, Texas. Crowley is around a 3-hour drive from San Angelo, where Brandon and his family currently lived. He soon informed his father on the phone that he was coming to his house, and at 11:54 p.m., Brandon jumped into his silver Ford F-150 and hit the road. A little over half an hour later, at 12:30 a.m., Brandon placed a phone call to his brother Kyle. He informed Kyle that he had run out of gas along U.S. Route 277 between San Angelo and Brant, Texas. Kyle was concerned, as Brandon didn't sound coherent on the phone at the time. Brandon would tell Kyle that 3 expletives are chasing me out of town. Kyle would confirm that Brandon was talking about the Mexicans in the neighborhood. Kyle would question Brandon on his sobriety, and Brandon would vehemently deny being under the influence at the time. Shortly after the call, Kyle, along with his wife and 4-year-old son, would get in their vehicle and make their way over to Brandon's house, where LaDessa had left a gas can out for them. Kyle and Brandon would exchange more phone calls over the next little while, but Kyle would state that often Brandon would only speak a sentence or two before the call was hung up or dropped. During that time frame, Brandon would tell his brother at one point that he was bleeding. What from, we simply don't know. That now brings us to 12:50 a.m. Brandon Lawson would call 911 for help. When Brandon made the call to 911, it rang over at a local nursing home in Robert Lee, Texas. Brandon would proceed to tell the responder that he had run out of gas and that he needed the police. During the call, Lawson made several confusing and incoherent statements. We will now dive into that phone call. Before we do, if you want to dive into this story even further, I have to recommend you check out True Crime Garage. They did an amazing episode on this story, and they really work hard to analyze and decipher the telephone call Brandon made. I personally don't think anyone has analyzed the audio quite like they have. With that said, let's listen to Brandon's call and see what each of you can make of it.
9/2013, 0:50 and 38 seconds.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. It's like we just pushed some guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. You got to take the bitch to the woods. Quick burning.
Okay, now run that by
me. The one I talked to him, I surely ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
That's the first guy.
You need an ambulance?
Yes, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? Hello? Hello?
Now, before we continue on, I would love to hear from each of you. I want to know what you think of the 911 call. I myself will come back to the call shortly to give you my thoughts. Now, let's continue on with the chain of events. Just minutes after the call to 911 at 12:56 a.m., a trucker called into 911 to report a truck that was parked in a dangerous way along the highway. This would later be confirmed to be Brandon Lawson's truck. Now, from 12:50 a.m. to 1:15 a.m., Brandon made calls to his brother, his girlfriend, his neighbor, and the 911 dispatcher. Many of these calls went straight to voicemail due to Brandon's lack of cell reception at the time. A police officer would arrive around 1:10 a.m. to Brandon's truck. Around the exact same time, Kyle Lawson pulled up to the truck while on the phone with his brother Brandon. Brandon would tell Kyle that he saw him arrive, but at no point does Kyle or the police officer ever see Brandon anywhere in the vicinity of his abandoned truck. At the time this was all going on, Kyle made an assumption that Brandon was hiding from the police officer due to the fact that he had an active arrest warrant out for him. The call between Kyle and Brandon would eventually drop, and it's been reported that from 1:19 a.m. and on, all calls to Brandon's phone began going straight to voicemail. His phone may have been turned off, it may have been broken, we simply don't know what happened during that short period of time. With Brandon not answering his phone, Kyle eventually got his family out of there and took them home. At dawn, Kyle would head back to Brandon's truck, but there was still no sign of Brandon to be found. At 8 a.m. that morning, the police had Brandon's truck towed from the area. The police were also quick to suspect that perhaps Kyle was trying to help his brother evade police custody. Kyle would submit to 2 polygraph tests and was eventually cleared, but the question still remained: where was Brandon Lawson? Police would begin their search of the area around Brandon's truck, but they didn't find any sign of Brandon. They searched the area with thermal imaging cameras, airplanes, and even brought in numerous cadaver dogs, but not a single trace of Brandon was ever found. Over the years, this story was analyzed over and over, but still no sign of Brandon was discovered until February 4th of 2022, almost a decade after his disappearance. It's been reported that a search party for Brandon stumbled upon some clothing that was believed to be his. The Texas Rangers were soon informed, and a more thorough investigation of the area was performed. This ultimately led to the discovery of human remains. Those remains were sent off for DNA testing, and as of now, 2 years later, there is still no clear-cut answer. All we know is that testing has found that the remains are indeed male. The test was also able to extract some genetic markers that can be compared to DNA from Brandon's father in an attempt to ID them as being Brandon, but it's not 100% at this point. To make matters more confusing is where are the rest of the remains? From my research, it doesn't appear that they found a large amount of remains. It also doesn't appear that they found Brandon's keys, wallet, or cell phone. Now, it appears the search team did in fact return to the area to conduct more searches, but it's been reported that the property where the remains were found is thick with brush and cactus, so not all of it was able to be searched. In the end, many believe that the remains are Brandon Lawson, as the clothing found matches what he was wearing on the night he went missing. Also, Texas is very hot, and a body exposed to those elements for close to a decade, well, it's a miracle any evidence was left behind at all. Some believe that Brandon came upon a scene that he shouldn't have, and he may have been killed over it. while some will say that he was hallucinating and the drugs had caused him to experience things that simply weren't there. We simply don't know where the truth lies, but I will say, based on the audio, I think I do in fact hear potential gunshots during the 911 call. If those are gunshots, then clearly Brandon was not alone at the time of this call.
9/2013 0:50 and 38 seconds.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. The state was just pushed some guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. You got to take the bitch to the woods. Quick burn.
Okay, now run that
The
round.
one I talked is from High Cellar in East Home.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
That's the first guy.
You need an ambulance?
Yes, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? 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 Hello?
But that's not the end of this case, as the rabbit hole seems to deepen even more. Now, when we discussed Kyle's calls with his brother, well, there wasn't a ton of information about what was said on each call. Now, this is a case I have followed for a very long time, and the podcast Crawl Space actually did an interview with Brandon's brother. This interview clears up a lot of information on Brandon's case, but also opens up a lot of questions. Let's go ahead and listen to that segment of the interview now.
And I was about to eat dinner when my mother called me and asked if I would please go over to their house and calm my brother down because he was flipping out. When I arrived at their house, my brother Brandon was already gone. So I asked Ladessa what was going on, and she said he was tripping and flipping out. On my way there, my brother calls me, says that Ladessa had some Mexicans from the neighborhood chasing him out of town. He told me that the state trooper had pulled one of them over, but there were still two chasing him. He hung up on me, then calls me back and tells me that he is about to run out of gas. He needed me to bring him some gas, so I told him, okay, that I had to go back by his house to pick up a gas can and come straight to him. So I went to his house, I got the gas can, and I headed that way. Well, Brandon kept calling me, and he would say a few words and hang up. The first time he asked where I was and to hurry up, I told him that I was on the way as fast as I could. Then he called back, and Audrey answered, and he said, where are y'all? I'm bleeding, Audrey. And Audrey, hurry up and get here. And he hung up. Then he calls me again and says, where are you at? I said, I'm pulling up right now. He hung up again. So when I pulled up to his truck, I make a U-turn and park on the opposite side of the road. I get out, walk over to his truck, and he calls. I ask him, where are you, bro? He said, I'm right here where I said. At that time, there was a vehicle approaching, and he says to me, one time, run. I told him, I'm not going to run. I've done nothing wrong. And he said, where is your pride, motherfucker? And hung up on me. At this time, the officer was walking up from behind the truck, and he says, is this your truck? I told him, no, it's my brother's truck that he had ran out of gas, and he was walking down the road. He keeps losing signals, so I asked if he mind me driving down the street to look for him, and he said, yeah, but he's not back that way because I just come from that way. So I said, okay. I had not known that my brother had made a 911 call in between the time he was calling me on my way there. It makes no sense to me why he would call 911 call saying he needed the cops, and then right after he tells me to run from the police. But I drove down the street and I stopped. I and Audrey both repeatedly calling him and texting him, and he would not respond. My son was only a few years old, and he was tiring and hungry, so we went back to my bank in San Angelo so that I could get some money. my check had been direct deposited into my account. So I got the money. I got some food for my son. I got some gas in my car. Then I went and picked up our friend Chris that we had worked with and asked him if he would come with me to look for him. So he got in and we went back to where my brother's truck was. And the police officer was gone. So we drove down the road very slow, hollering and screaming his name out, and he never would come. So I went down to the gas station and parked on the side while Audrey got out, got the gas can out of the trunk, and went and put $5 in a gas can. And then I drove back down to my brother's truck, and I got out and put the gas in his truck, and I yelled out there, "Gas in your truck, bro. The laws are gone. Get in it, and go." Still nothing. We drove up and down Highway 277 for about an hour, and no sign. Then the law enforcement had my brother's truck towed at 9 o'clock a.m. that morning. And then that is when my sister-in-law, Odessa, called the sheriff's department and told them what was going on. They acted like I was lying to them about everything just because I didn't tell him that night that my brother had a felony warrant and was hiding in the woods. Had I known that my brother had made a 911 call not seconds in between the times I talked to him, I would have said something. But I did not know, and I wasn't about to snitch my brother out. That's not just something we don't do. We never have. I sit and I think of things that I could have done differently, but it doesn't change anything because my brother is still missing. The Coke County Sheriff's Office and the Texas Ranger that is on my brother's case, they wanted me to come in for interviewing, and so I did. They seem to think that I just picked my brother up and gave him a ride that night and dropped him off. So I told them that I would like to take a polygraph test, and so they agreed. So I went down to take the test, and they gave me 2 tests. The first test, one was about if I gave him a ride somewhere that night, if I dropped him off somewhere, or if I came in contact with him after the last time I said I had that night, and I passed it. The second test was asking if I had harmed or hurt him and had taken his body somewhere, or if I took him and done something with him. More or less, they wanted to know if I killed my own brother, and I passed it. Then I don't believe that they have done anything with his case since.
Now let's go ahead and dive into the timeline and point out something I find very confusing. Brandon's 911 call came in at 12:50 a.m. On the call, he's clearly panicked and in need of help. Now, a piece of information I think is important for you all to know would be that no officer was ever sent out that night to try and find Brandon. In fact, the 911 call from Brandon wasn't even known about initially within this case. Now, the 911 call clearly shows Brandon in need of police help. So why, when the cops did show up at Brandon's truck, did Brandon tell his brother he was hiding nearby and then proceed to run away from the scene? Within 20 minutes, he went from meeting the police to actively running away from the cops. This is a piece of information I simply can't wrap my head around. Also, within the interview with Kyle, he talks about how Brandon told him that Odessa had Mexicans in the neighborhood chasing him out of town. He also told his brother that the state trooper had pulled one of them over, but 2 others were still chasing him. Now, based on the timeline, this chase would have been while Brandon was in his vehicle. Now, in researching the story, there were no reported state troopers within the area on that night. If Kyle is telling the truth, I think this makes sense when it comes to Brandon's 911 call. In the very beginning of the call, Brandon states, "Yes, I'm in the middle of a field. The Stapers just pulled some guys over. We're out here going towards Abilene on both sides." Now, does he say Staper, or is he trying to say state trooper?
Yeah, I'm in the middle of the field. The Stapers just pushed some guys over. Right here going towards Abilene on both sides. Yeah, I'm in the middle of the field. The Stapers just pushed some guys over. Right here going towards Abilene on both sides.
Now, perhaps he was rushing his words when he said it, or was this 911 call edited by the police? As some believe the word state trooper may have been edited to hide the fact that maybe there was some form of law enforcement already out there that night. Now, the confusing part here is the fact that I know some people point towards police corruption in this case. There are a lot of people that have analyzed the phone call. Many believe you can hear 3 gunshots within it, with Brandon saying, "Help me," very faintly at the very end. I tried to isolate the "help me," and I probably played it back and manipulated the audio 100 different ways, and the more I listen, the more I start to think I can hear "help me." Now, the human brain's an amazing thing, but at the same time, if you're trying to focus so much on hearing something, your brain can eventually start to feed you what you want to hear. People want to hear "help me," so they start to hear it and they're sold on it. The problem with all of this, in the end, is the timeline. That call came in at 12:50 a.m., yet Kyle was speaking to his brother on the phone 20 minutes later when the cop showed up at his truck. Brandon tells his brother on the phone to run. Kyle says, "I'm not running, I did nothing wrong." And Brandon says, "Where is your pride, motherfucker?" and hangs up the call. Now, this is the biggest thing in the case that I get very hung up on. 20 minutes earlier, Brandon needed help from the police. He said he was being chased down by people and that a state trooper pulled one over. On the call, he said he's in a field and that he needs the cops, not an ambulance. That leads me to believe something nefarious happened after the call ended. But that can't be the case if Brandon was then on the phone with his brother 20 minutes later near his truck. Something isn't adding up. Would Brandon's brother lie about talking to his brother when he said he did? Perhaps, but it's hard to understand why he would do so. Now, this is just a theory of mine, and it ventures quite a ways down the conspiracy rabbit hole. But what if Brandon witnessed a state trooper or officer doing something he wasn't supposed to see? What if he was then killed over what he saw? What if that cop was then involved in finding Brandon's truck and Kyle at it? Kyle was there, with his family at the time. He had his child in the car. What if Kyle's life, as well as his family's life, were threatened that night? What if they were told what to say and do by some very bad and very corrupt individuals? This could be why Kyle explains the story the way he does. Also, at the time, Kyle and the police had zero idea that a 911 call had come in from Brandon at all. Brandon could have been shot at the end of the call 3 times, his last whisper being, "Help me," as the phone lays just away from his face. Then the corrupt individual went about covering things up, and Kyle went along with everything to protect his family. Then the 911 call is brought to light and throws a wrench in the timeline completely. Now I know that's probably a long shot theory, but it was just a thought I had. Either way, I can't wrap my head around why Brandon wanted the police one moment and 20 minutes later is actively running and hiding from the police. Early on in the case, some believe Brandon had run away from his life to start over, as he had cashed out his 401k recently and was starting a new job soon. Now, with the remains found along with the clothing that matched Brandon's clothes, it's believed by his family and friends that Brandon passed away that night. So him running off is no longer a valid theory. I think there's only a few possibilities in this case. Theory 1 involves Brandon being under the influence that night. He was exhausted, he was using again, and he was seeing things that simply were not there. His truck runs out of gas, he calls his brother, he wanders from the truck, and he spirals, eventually calling 911 and placing that odd phone call. The cop eventually shows up on scene, and Kyle is still speaking with his brother. Brandon was either nearby watching as he stated he was, or wasn't anywhere nearby, but was hallucinating the entire thing. From there, Brandon eventually wanders too far and passes away. He could have been claimed by the elements, or he could have been claimed by a rattlesnake bite. From my research, rattlesnakes are prominent in that area. Also, the place where the human remains were found is said to have numerous rattlesnakes nearby. If you believe some form of this theory, then what happened to Brandon was simply a tragic situation. On the other hand, you have my police cover-up theory, or you have a theory involving foul play of some kind. Was someone actually chasing Brandon out there that night? Was he killed by law enforcement? Was he killed by someone who had followed him out there? Is Brandon's brother even telling the truth? In the end, his brother was polygraphed and cleared by the police. But could this case have corruption involved in it at every end? We don't have answers, but in researching this case, I did discover a new piece of information I had never heard before. Like the Maura Murray case I did a deep dive on, the Brandon Lawson case is one I have been following for years and years. So when researching, I was constantly trying to find some new information. That's when I stumbled upon the Lore Lodge. They are a channel that does incredible work here on YouTube. In their video they did recently, they talk about some weird cover-up of information between the local newspaper and sheriff's office. It turns out the local paper was being run by the sheriff's wife at the time of Brandon's disappearance. I discovered the Lore Lodge's dive into this information right before putting the video together and didn't have an opportunity to write up a script and dive into it a whole lot further on here. But I highly recommend you check out their video if you want to dive into this case even further. I really can't recommend the Lore Lodge any more than I already have. So as you see, information just doesn't seem to add up in an already baffling case, but I do wonder, did the Sheriff's Department have something to hide? In closing, I want to know what each and every one of you think. What do you think of the 911 call, and what do you think happened to Brandon? I would love to start a discussion amongst you all. I also want to say a quick thank you to everyone who came to the live stream the other night. It was a lot of fun, and I hope to do more stuff like that in the future. I also want to take a brief moment to send my condolences to all of Brandon Lawson's family and friends. I truly hope they get answers one day within this case. Thank you all for tuning in to another episode. If you enjoy the content, please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps the channel continue to grow. It's also very important that you hit the notification bell and turn on notifications, as you may not be alerted of my uploads if you don't do so. In the description box below, you'll find a link to my merch store and a link to the Cellar Dwellers membership tier for the channel. If you're interested, please take a moment to check those things out. If you'd like to submit your own scary story or any kind of story recommendation, you can do so using the email linked in the description box below. As always, I do all the research, writing, recording, and editing for the channel myself, so anything that you do to help support the channel is greatly appreciated. And until next time, I will see you all again as we head back into the cellar.